Defend American Ideals is very pleased to co-sponsor this important discussion. More details about us are available on our website at defendamericanideals.com. We are honored to have Robert Woodson as our keynote speaker today. Bob and I will engage in a conversation for about 15 minutes before the next panel featuring Betty and Andrew. Bob is the founder and president of the Woodson Center, 1776 Unites, and Voices of Black Mothers United. He is an influential leader on the issues of poverty alleviation and empowering disadvantaged communities to become agents of their own uplift. He is also a sought-after social commentator, and I'm sure many of you have seen him on TV. He has appeared on Fox News, NBC, CNN, C-SPAN, and other networks. Bob, welcome. Great to see you.
Pleased to be here.
Well, few policymakers were discussing reparations seriously until a few years ago. Today, we've seen reparations proposals proliferating around the country. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think because of the attention given to the murders of killing of Freddie Gray in Baltimore a decade ago, followed by Michael Brown, George Floyd, all of this, these police encounters like this has really energized what I call the race grievance industry. And it's always been at the expense of low-income people. For instance, what's happening is like in Cincinnati, when the young man was killed by a police officer, Sharpton and the other came in, organized a boycott of Cincinnati. And as a consequence, you have your first incidence of police nullification. The police said, well, if we're going to be charged for trying to be aggressive and high crime, we will then not police as aggressively. As a consequence, during the course of the next 6 months, the murder rate in high crime Black areas went up 800%. But none of the civil rights leaders or pastors that were advocating the sanctions against the police or the boycott of the city had to suffer the consequence of their advocacy. And that pattern continues with Michael Brown in Ferguson. Of the 51 people arrested for rioting and looting in Ferguson, only one was from Ferguson. And as a consequence, when I went there, you saw people were cut off from the city because they had to depend on public transport. In other words, low-income Blacks have suffered the consequence of us racializing the issue. And so the reparations is just one expression of what this unfortunate emphasis that has the consequence of hurting the very people they say they're trying to help.
Okay, well, so Congressman Barbara Lee, the highest ranking Black woman appointed to the Democratic leadership in the U.S. House of Representatives, she clearly has a somewhat different view. Here's what she said just in May of this year. She said, quote, "Reparations are not a luxury for our people, but a human right long overdue for millions of Americans. A promise of 40 acres and a meal made to formerly enslaved people over 150 years ago has yet to be filled," unquote. What do you think of that comment?
Well, because first of all, you cannot generalize about any group of people and then arrive at solutions that satisfies all. For instance, the troubling questions that don't get raised is that what about the 3,700 free Blacks who owned slaves, 13,000 slaves? Do their descendants pay? What about the Native Americans, the 5 civilized tribes? They had 3,000 slaves that took on their Trail of Tears. Now, do the descendants of those Native Americans that owned slaves, do they pay? And what about the whites who came here after slavery ended? What about those that were in the Underground Railroad? So the issue becomes a little more complicated than just all whites are villains and all Blacks are victims.
Right. Now, to many people, money is what matters. A concerned citizen who showed up at the California Reparations Task Force public meeting in early May said the following, quote, "True liberation starts with money," unquote. Now, this past June, when the California Reparations Task Force actually issued their formal recommendations, they recommended up to $1.2 million per year for each qualified Black resident. Now, similarly, last December, when a city-appointed advisory committee on reparations in the city of San Francisco issued their recommendations, they called for up to $5 million paid to each qualified resident. Now, we're not talking about just money here. We're talking about lots and lots of it. Is that what true liberation looks like?
I mean, this is ridiculous. First of all, it's how money is used. Wealth is not created by giving people money. Anytime you separate work from income, it has a harmful effect on the person doing it. Just look at the history of the people who won the lottery. 70% of them end up destroying their lives, 70%. Welfare and the $22 trillion we spent in the poverty program was considered reparations, where 70 cents of every dollar didn't go to the people suffering the problem, but it went to those who served the problem. So just the absence of money. But any group's participation in the economy does not depend on what government gives them. It's their small business formation rate. If you look at a healthy community generates 3 businesses for 1,000 people per year. So if you look at Chinese, Koreans, Nigerians, Caribbean Blacks, they have a higher small business formation rate. So this is where the emphasis, it isn't government giving money, transferring money to people. First of all, the practical is if you give reparations to that amount of people, they better spend some of that on security to protect them from those who didn't get those checks.
Especially crime rate being as high as it.
That's what you're going to be spending some of that money on.
Well, excuse me for interrupting. I was saying, especially with the crime rates being as high as they are across the country, security certainly would be advised for people with lots of money. Now, a lot of the reparations proposals, and our colleagues in the next panel will talk more specifically about what's in them, but what we've seen thus far is that these proposals tend to be coupled with a large number of social justice demands. So they're not calling for just money, they're calling for things like affirmative action, police reform, home ownership, prison reform, and so on. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on this quote by economist Dr. Thomas Sowell. And he said, quote, "There are people today who talk justice when they really mean payback, including payback against people who were not even born when historic injustices were committed," unquote. Is that what we are seeing from the social justice demands in the reparations movement?
You know, I really think it's virtue signaling. The officials who seem to be entertaining these proposals, it's a way for them to patronize these protesters because they know that some of these amounts are larger than the state's own budget. So, but it's also, it deflects attention away from the more critical challenges facing us. But people can appear to be a social justice warrior by advocating these abstract recommendations and go on television. They can make a lot of money, just like Black Lives Matter profited from it, $100 million. Now, Abraham Kendi, the high priest of racial justice at Boston University, burned through $50 million in the last 3 years without producing any research. But that's not a scandal. But we ought to be talking about that as well. And the real solutions are found not by looking at the polarization of like whites are villains to be paid and blacks are victims. When you look at life through that kind of prism, it always benefits the ones at the top. In other words, if we have to look at life through a racial prism, when evil wears a black face, it escapes responsibility. there was a 2-hour special on the condition of women in prisons. For 2 hours, we were served up where they were being raped. Every one of the villains was Black. Every one of the victims was Black. And yet, after that show was over, it didn't generate any discussion about what are we going to do to help these poor women, because you cannot generalize about women. So what are the recommendations when we talk about women? They will be given appointments on boards of directors. That's affirmative action. In other words, you use the conditions of all women as the bait, and the switch occurs when the remedies arrive and the resources, and they go not to those at the bottom, but those at the top in the name of all. And the same will be true with reparations. A lot of the middle class people who are running these organizations, including the caucus, in 2010, they get about $60 million in private donations from corporations. Part of that money in 2010 was
which caucus are you referring to?
The Congressional Black Caucus, of which Barbara Lee is a part.
Right.
I'm really saying that, and they were given money. Part of it was to go to scholarships for low-income Black kids in their district. Well, after an investigative reporter found that the bulk of that money went to the sons and daughters of staff members and grandchildren of caucus members. And they said, oops, and they came back. But they're going to be escape responsibility, because race is being used as a shield against holding people responsible. And my position is we must look at the evil that is being done to people. But if we have to if it has to fit a racial narrative, real evil, when it comes wearing a blackface, will escape accountability and responsibility. And that adversely affects low-income people in these communities.
Well, we've got just a couple of minutes left. Let me ask you one last question. Your social activism dates back to the 1960s. You fought for civil rights in the era of Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, this year happens to be the 60th anniversary of his I Have a Dream speech. What do you think Dr. King would think about reparations and the demands for reparations today, or the demands for the kind of social justice agenda we see today?
His last address, Dr. King said, Black America must reach down into the deep, dark regions of its soul and sign and ink its own Emancipation Proclamation, something that Malcolm X stood for too, that liberation will come when Blacks begin to elevate themselves. And so what a lot of the groups that the Woodson Center supports, like Voices of Black Mothers United and others, these are people who are looking in the past and say, when whites were at their worst, we were at their best. When we built our own railroad, we built our own hotels, our schools, we closed the education gap. In other words, a lot of our advocates today are looking back at the values, not the wealth or the money, but the values that sustained us in slavery and in Jim Crow. And they are applying those same values in some of the most toxic neighborhoods that we support. And so our time and attention should not be on reparations, the assumption that money is the solution, but we should be investing in people that are engaged in self-help and self-restoration in these communities, instead of looking at all problems have to have a bipolar solution. Blacks can only benefit if whites are hurt. We must find non-polarizing solutions to the problem. But the problems facing America is moral and spiritual in crisis, not economic. That's why, according to the Harvard study, the highest level of death for children or young people is homicide in the urban communities, suicide among affluent whites in Silicon Valley, where teen suicide is 6 times the national average, and among Appalachian whites, it is prescription drugs. So we have to come together as a nation and put aside the racial lens to which we look at these problems and address the real problems, and that is a moral and spiritual free fall that is consuming our young people. We can't do that if we have to be sitting here talking about reparations.
Well, on that note, this concludes our Q&A session, but thank you very much for those comments.